Hey everyone, before this story takes you where it's about to go, pause for just a second. If stories of underestimated women rising, reclaiming power, and turning doubt into dominance speak to you, make sure you like, subscribe, and stay connected. This is where quiet strength becomes loud success. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion. This story begins in a season of my life where survival wore the mask of routine. Every morning looked the same, every night felt heavier than the last, and every dream I carried had been neatly folded and tucked away for later. I was working hard, but freedom still felt like a luxury reserved for other people. Bills dictated my schedule, exhaustion shaped my decisions, and my potential waited patiently in the background, unseen and uncelebrated it. In that space, $250 entered my life not as a gift, not as a miracle, but as a decision. It was money that could have gone to comfort, distraction, or temporary relief. Instead, it became a question I could no longer ignore. Would I spend it maintaining the life that was draining me, or would I risk it on the life I secretly believed I deserved? That moment wasn't dramatic on the outside. No applause, no sudden clarity. Just a quiet resolve settling into my bones. The hustle itself was small enough to be dismissed by anyone not paying attention. It didn't come with a flashy title or instant validation. It lived in the margins of my day, carved out of early mornings and late nights. It required learning on the fly, failing in private, and showing up even when the results weren't immediate. Every dollar spent felt heavier than it should have, because it carried hope, fear, and defiance all at once. The laughter came quickly and effortlessly from people who had already decided what my limits were. They laughed at the number, at the scale, at the idea that something so modest could ever challenge the systems that kept people like me boxed in. To them, $250 was insignificant. To me, it was proof that I was finally betting on myself. Each step forward demanded discipline. There were no shortcuts, no secret doors. I tracked every expense, studied every mistake, and reinvested every small win. The hustle didn't grow overnight, but something else did. My confidence began to stretch beyond the narrow space it had been confined to. I started seeing patterns where I once saw chaos. I started trusting my instincts where I once sought permission. What people didn't see was how that small hustle changed the way I moved through the world. I stopped shrinking. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped waiting for approval. The money was important, but the mindset shift was revolutionary. I was no longer just surviving circumstances. I was shaping outcomes. There were moments when doubt tried to reclaim its territory. Late nights when exhaustion whispered that the laughter had been right, that I was doing too much for too little. But every time that thought surfaced, I remembered why I started. I remembered the version of myself that felt trapped, unseen, and underestimated. I refused to go back. The hustle became a mirror, reflecting my discipline, my creativity, and my resilience. Each small return wasn't just income. It was confirmation. Confirmation that I could build something from nothing. Confirmation that my vision didn't need permission. Confirmation that freedom was not a fantasy but a process. As the first returns came in, subtle but real, I felt a shift in my energy. I walked differently. I planned differently. I spoke about my future with a certainty that surprised even me. The laughter began to fade into background noise, replaced by a quiet respect that came from consistency rather than announcement. By the end of that first phase, the $250 had done more than multiply. It had ignited a sense of ownership over my life. I wasn't free yet, but I was no longer powerless. And that distinction changed everything. The chapter closes here, not with a victory lap, but with a deeper commitment forming. Because what started as a small hustle was about to become something no one could laugh at anymore. The next chapter would demand more focus, more courage, and more sacrifice as the cost of freedom began to reveal itself. The second chapter didn't begin with celebration. It began with responsibility. Once the first signs of progress appeared, the pressure intensified. Success, even in its earliest form, has a way of testing whether belief was real or just situational. I realized quickly that momentum could disappear as fast as it arrived if I didn't treat this hustle like a foundation rather than a lucky break. I stopped seeing my effort as temporary and started treating it as a system. Every action had to serve a purpose. Every hour had to justify its place. I studied not just how to earn but how to sustain. I learned that freedom isn't built on excitement. It's built on structure. While others waited for motivation, I built habits. While others chased trends, I focused on mastery. The same people who laughed before now watched quietly. Not because the numbers were shocking yet, but because the consistency was undeniable. I showed up every day even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. The hustle demanded growth, and growth demanded discomfort. I had to unlearn shortcuts and embrace patience. Mistakes became teachers instead of evidence of failure. Losses became lessons instead of reasons to quit. I understood that every misstep carried information, and every correction sharpened my instincts. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about self-trust. As income slowly increased, so did my vision. I no longer thought in terms of survival. I thought in terms of leverage. How could one win support the next? How could one skill unlock another opportunity? The hustle evolved, expanding carefully, intentionally. I refused to rush what I was building just to prove something to people who never believed in it anyway. The most powerful shift happened internally. I stopped needing validation. I stopped explaining my moves. Silence became my strategy. Focus became my language. I realized that true empowerment isn't loud. It's precise. It's disciplined. It's patient. The money, while still modest, began to relieve pressure. Small bills disappeared. Choices expanded. Time felt less hostile. For the first time, I tasted what independence could feel like, even in fragments. And those fragments were enough to fuel me forward. There were sacrifices that didn't make it into highlight reels. Social moments declined. Comfort was postponed. Rest was earned, not assumed. But none of it felt like loss. It felt like investment. Every trade-off carried intention. As my hustle matured, so did my understanding of freedom. Freedom wasn't about escaping work. It was about choosing it. It wasn't about luxury. It was about control. Control over time, energy, and direction. Control that no one could take away because it was built from within. By the end of this chapter, the $250 was no longer the story. The story was the woman who learned how to multiply belief, discipline, and vision. The woman who turned laughter into fuel and small wins into strategy. And just as stability began to feel real, a new challenge emerged. Because growth always demands another level. The next chapter would test not just my hustle but my identity. The question was no longer whether I could build something. The question became whether I was ready to fully claim my freedom. But its weight was heavier than everything before it. This was the phase no one talks about when they celebrate independence. The phase where growth stops feeling exciting and starts feeling isolating. By now, the hustle was no longer fragile, but neither was it comfortable. It demanded evolution, not just effort. It demanded that I become someone new. What once felt like ambition now felt like responsibility. The freedom I had tasted in fragments began asking for commitment. I realized that success doesn't just change circumstances, it challenges identity. I could no longer think the way I used to and still expect to move forward. Old habits, old fears, and old versions of myself became obstacles rather than companions. The more consistent the income became, the more strategic my decisions had to be. I learned quickly that money without direction is just noise. I started thinking long-term, weighing consequences and choosing patience over impulse. Every move had to protect what I was building. This was no longer a side hustle. This was infrastructure. The laughter from before had fully disappeared, replaced by curiosity and subtle discomfort. Some people didn't know how to engage with me anymore. I was no longer asking for advice. I was no longer seeking approval. My energy had shifted and not everyone could stand in it. That realization hurt more than I expected, but it also clarified something important. Growth often requires distance. There were moments when the pressure felt relentless. Expectations increased, both internal and external. I felt the weight of proving that this wasn't luck, that this wasn't temporary. But then I understood something transformative. I didn't owe consistency to doubters. I owed integrity to myself. The hustle didn't need to impress anyone. It needed to sustain me. I became ruthless with my time. Every distraction was evaluated. Every commitment questioned. I protected my focus like it was currency because it was. The more disciplined I became, the clearer my vision grew. I wasn't just working toward freedom anymore. I was designing it. With growth came fear, but it was a different kind of fear. Not the fear of failure, but the fear of visibility. As opportunities expanded, so did exposure. Being seen meant being judged. Being successful meant being misunderstood. I had to learn how to stand in my truth without shrinking under scrutiny. The hustle began opening doors I never thought were meant for me. New environments, new conversations, new expectations. I walked into spaces knowing I had earned my place, even when no one else knew my story. That confidence didn't come from validation. It came from discipline, from nights no one witnessed, from sacrifices no one applauded. I also learned the cost of saying no. Saying no to distractions. Saying no to comfort. Saying no to people who only remembered me when I was accessible. Each no protected the yes I was building toward. And with every boundary I set, I felt stronger, clearer, more aligned. There were days when exhaustion crept in quietly, when the weight of responsibility pressed down hard. But even in those moments I recognized how far I had come. I wasn't tired from surviving anymore. I was tired from building. And that difference mattered. As the numbers grew, so did my self-respect. I stopped negotiating my worth. I stopped accepting crumbs disguised as opportunities. I understood that empowerment isn't about proving strength. It's about honoring it. I honored my time, my energy, and my vision with a level of seriousness I once reserved for other people's dreams. By the end of this chapter, the hustle had transformed me in ways money never could. I had become disciplined, intentional, and grounded. I no longer reacted to doubt. I anticipated challenges and met them prepared. I was no longer chasing freedom. I was aligning with it. But just when stability felt earned, life introduced its next test. Because true independence isn't proven during growth. It's proven during resistance. And the next chapter would challenge everything I thought I had mastered, forcing me to defend not just my hustle but the woman I had become. It arrived disguised as routine. On the surface, everything looked stable. The hustle was consistent, the income predictable, the structure solid. But beneath that calm, pressure was building. This was the chapter where freedom stopped being an idea and started being examined. Every system I built would now be tested not by strangers, but by circumstances that demanded resilience. Challenges emerged not as dramatic failures, but as subtle disruptions. Costs increased. Time tightened. Energy stretched thin. I learned that sustainability requires more than success. It requires adaptability. The same strategies that built momentum could not always protect it. Growth demanded refinement. I was forced to confront my limits honestly. Not as weaknesses but as signals. Signals telling me where to delegate, where to learn, where to evolve. I could no longer do everything myself and still expect to move forward. Control had to shift from micromanagement to leadership. That transition was uncomfortable but necessary. The emotional test was heavier than the logistical one. Independence can be lonely when you're the one carrying the vision. There were fewer people to celebrate with and even fewer to confide in. Not because support didn't exist, but because not everyone understood what it meant to protect something fragile yet powerful. I learned how to hold joy privately and process doubt without broadcasting it. The outside world began responding differently. Opportunities came with expectations attached. Some doors opened only if I was willing to shrink, compromise, or explain myself. I refused. I understood now that freedom isn't just about earning power. It's about choosing alignment over approval. Every decision became a vote for the life I wanted to maintain. There were moments when walking away felt riskier than staying. But staying would have cost me my integrity. I chose long-term peace over short-term gain. Those choices didn't always feel victorious in the moment, but they built something stronger than applause. They built self-trust. I refined my systems, tightened my focus, and strengthened my boundaries. I learned how to protect my energy as fiercely as my income. Rest became strategic. Reflection became essential. I stopped glorifying burnout and started honoring sustainability. Freedom, I realized, isn't proven by how much you can endure, but by how well you can preserve yourself. The hustle matured into something quieter, more powerful. It didn't need constant attention anymore. It operated with intention, not urgency. I had created something that could support me without consuming me. That realization shifted my perspective completely. I wasn't trapped by my success. I was supported by it. The laughter from the beginning felt distant now, almost irrelevant. Those voices no longer lived in my head. What mattered was the woman I had become in their absence. Grounded. Unapologetic. I understood that revenge isn't about proving people wrong. It's about proving yourself right. As freedom settled into my life more fully, I recognized a deeper responsibility. Not just to maintain it but to respect it. Freedom requires stewardship. It requires wisdom. It requires gratitude without complacency. I held all three carefully. By the end of this chapter, the hustle was no longer the center of my life. It was the support system that allowed me to choose how I showed up in the world. And with that clarity came the final realization. True empowerment isn't about escape. It's about ownership. The next chapter would close this journey, not with an ending but with a declaration. Because what began as a $250 risk had become a permanent shift in identity. And the final chapter would reveal what freedom truly looks like when it's fully claimed. Because by the time it came, I was ready. There was no chaos to overcome, no doubt to silence, no proof left to offer. What remained was clarity. The kind that only comes when you've walked through uncertainty and built something solid on the other side. This chapter wasn't about expansion or defense. It was about ownership. The $250 that once felt like a risky decision had long stopped being about money. It had become a symbol. A reminder of the moment I chose myself without guarantees. That choice echoed through every layer of my life now. The freedom I lived in wasn't loud or flashy. It was steady. It was intentional. It was mine. My days no longer revolved around survival. They revolved around alignment. I chose how to spend my time, who to give my energy to, and what deserved my focus. That control was the real victory. Not the income, not the recognition, but the authority over my own life. No one could rush me. No one could pressure me. No one could define my worth. I moved through the world with a calm confidence that couldn't be shaken by opinions. I had nothing to prove and everything to protect. The hustle continued to operate, but it no longer demanded constant attention. It had become a tool, not a tether. I had built it to serve my life, not replace it. The most powerful transformation was internal. I trusted myself fully. I trusted my judgment, my instincts, my timing. The fear that once shaped my decisions no longer had authority. In its place stood discernment. I knew when to act and when to wait. I knew when to push and when to pause. That wisdom was earned, not borrowed. People began to see me differently, but more importantly, I saw myself differently. I no longer introduced myself through struggle. I no longer carried past limitations into present conversations. I stood in rooms knowing I belonged there, not because someone invited me but because I built the path myself. The laughter from the beginning was now just a memory, stripped of its power. It had served its purpose. It lit the fire, sharpened my focus, and strengthened my resolve. But it no longer lived with me. I carried peace instead. A quiet, grounded peace rooted in self-respect. Freedom revealed itself in unexpected ways. In the ability to rest without guilt. In the confidence to say no without explanation. In the joy of choosing growth without pressure. These moments mattered more than any milestone. They were proof that independence is not a destination but a way of being. I understood now that empowerment isn't about becoming untouchable. It's about becoming unshakable. The world can shift, circumstances can change, but what I built within myself would remain. That was the true return on investment. This journey wasn't about revenge, but it carried its own kind of justice. A woman once underestimated now stood self-defined. A small hustle once laughed at now sustained a life designed with intention. And a decision once questioned now echoed as truth. As this story closes, remember this. Freedom doesn't require permission. It requires courage, consistency, and self-belief. Sometimes it starts with just $250. Sometimes it starts with nothing but a decision. Either way, when a Black Queen chooses herself, the outcome is inevitable. This has been Black Queen Dominion, where underestimated beginnings rise into undeniable power.